The last train of the evening pulls into Elephant and Castle station. A young woman steps on board. The staff member moves aside to let her through. Seconds later, he walks into that carriage. That woman is gone. She's not in the carriage and not on the platform. The only place that she could have gone was into the tunnel. But no alarm was raised, no search conducted. Staff already knew that they wouldn't find anything, because it wasn't the first time that this disappearing woman had been seen, and it wouldn't be the last. Because all along the Bakerloo Line, staff and passengers report things that just don't make sense. Figures that board trains and are never seen again. A staff tunnel where even seasoned contractors won't stay by themselves. The reflection of a long dead prisoner appearing in the glass of a moving train. And possibly something completely inhuman stalking the darkness underneath London. So similarly to the other Haunted London Underground episodes, we're going to be going station to station on the Bakerloo, getting all into the history and the weird goings-on that don't exactly get advertised by TfL, including something allegedly seen down there in the 50s that I'd genuinely never heard of before. And it gets weird, like extraterrestrial Men in Black weird. Yeah. But believe it or not, if it wasn't for one guy stepping in, we may not have actually had the Bakerloo Line as we know it today. An Act of Parliament gave the green light for a line between Baker Street and Waterloo. The company running it, imaginatively called the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, they then unfortunately went bust in 1901, halfway through the tunnelling work, which is not ideal. Luckily though, the company was saved by an American stockbroker called Charles Tyson Yerkes, and in March 1906, the first iteration of the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway was opened. It initially ran from Baker Street, obviously, right through to Kennington Road, which was later renamed Westminster Bridge Road, before becoming Lambeth North. So it went just a little bit past Waterloo anyway. It wasn't too long after that though that the extension to Elephant and Castle opened, in August of that year. But the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway. That's a bit much to say, isn't it? Yeah, apparently journalists agreed, and the line's name was quickly shortened to Bakerloo. Clever. The line has obviously been through more expansions and changes since it opened. At one point it served up to 45 different stations, but now the Bakerloo line is just over 23 kilometres long, stopping at 25 stations, running between Harrow and Wealdstone, right down to Elephant and Castle. With another interesting stop after the service terminates there, but we'll get into that, because it is time to mind the gap and stop at the first station going southbound on the Bakerloo line. And the first one that we need to talk about is Maida Vale. This station first opened in June 1915, when the Bakerloo pushed further north from Paddington to Queen's Park. Obviously, this was right in the First World War, and so many men had gone off to fight. This meant that Maida Vale station was the first to be entirely staffed by women, and stayed that way until 1919, when the men returned from war. Just absolutely iconic. Love that. But the ghost stories from Maida Vale, we're starting off gently, just a bit subtle, as there are multiple accounts of something being felt rather than seen here. Witnesses have claimed to feel the sensation of a hand being placed on top of theirs while they're standing on the escalator going up towards street level. And it's not just a, "oh, I'm holding your hand" kind of feeling. Apparently this invisible hand feels quite firm, pressing down on top of yours. And while saying that out loud, it sounds quite disconcerting. A hand you can't see pressing yours down onto the handrail. Witnesses say that they don't feel frightened by it. It feels more like something is just guiding you up the escalator. That's moving in a straight line escalator where there's only one way to go. But thank you anyway, ghost, that is very kind of you. Those are the only details we have of this encounter though, so we don't know who it is or why they're on forever escalator duty. But the next stop that we need to chat about is Marylebone. So the tube station was opened in March 1907 with the entrance sitting next to the main railway station. Back in those days it was actually called Great Central Station before being renamed to Marylebone in 1917. And while during the Second World War Marylebone wasn't targeted as much as other London railway stations, the original underground station entrance did actually suffer some damage, and so it had to be closed. This led to a new entrance being built inside the main ticket hall of the railway station. What I found interesting about this station entrance though was that it was actually one of the last in the entire underground network to have wooden escalators leading into the station. And if you haven't seen the Northern Line episode, you may be thinking, oh, so what? The thing was, it was actually a leading factor in the devastation of the King's Cross fire in 1987. So the fact that Marylebone still had one until 2004 is mildly terrifying. But the ghosts at Marylebone don't seem to lurk down underground. They're actually up in the main railway station above. There's one maintenance worker who decided in the early hours one morning in 2000, it's pretty quiet, I'm gonna try and get some shut-eye in the switch room of platform 1. As he settled down for his nap though, he saw something that had him wide awake and frozen in fear. He came face to face with the floating figure of a young woman wearing this lacy top, but her face was blurred out. It was there, but you couldn't make out any features on it, which is no. Don't like that. He didn't hang around long before absolutely booking it out of the room and almost colliding with a cleaner in his hasty retreat. The cleaner took one look at this guy, who was completely ashen by this point, and immediately said to him, "Have you just seen that ghostly woman without a face?" So yeah, it looks like she's seen reasonably regularly by staff. As always, regularly in the context of seeing a ghost. And while we don't have any more information on who this woman is, I did come across a story from before the station was even built, because back then this area was housing, and in May 1831, in one of those houses, apparently a husband and wife watched in terror as two ghostly candle flames floated over them while they were in bed. They were absolutely helpless as these flames became a glowing sort of liquid that poured onto the bed and disappeared. So that was certainly a story of something potentially going on way before Marylebone Station was even a thing. But if we get back on the underground, the next station along the Bakerloo Line where strange things have been reported is Regent's Park. It's just past Baker Street, so it was one of the original stops when the Bakerloo opened in 1906. But down on the platform, while you're waiting for your train, you may hear something unsettling, because both staff and passengers have claimed to hear the sounds of howling and moaning, coming most definitely from the darkness of the tunnels. Possibly, could that have anything to do with the fact that London Zoo is in Regent's Park? You know, that place where there are animals that howl? Is it somehow echoing down the tunnels? Although, if we are being picky, the zoo is on the opposite side of the park. Regent's Park isn't even the nearest stop to the zoo, and no other stations in the area seem to have the same issue. That said, sound can travel in weird ways. I used to live about 10-15 minutes away from the local zoo, and when the wind was blowing in the right direction, we could hear the monkeys at feeding time. Super weird thing to hear when you're alone in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. But the sound that definitely wouldn't travel that far is whispering. Because yeah, whispering has been heard down on the platforms of Regent's Park Station too. And just that mental image alone, you're standing waiting for your train on your own, and the next thing you hear whispering coming from the dark, empty tunnel. Nah, I've seen enough horror movies. Not today. But I don't think anyone has ever gotten to the bottom of these strange sounds being reported. Whether it is just sound travelling weird or whether it is something else. We don't really know. But it's time to get back on the train and on to our next stop, Embankment. And this station was actually already in operation by the time the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway came onto the scene, as it was opened in 1870, serving what would become the District Line. It was originally called Charing Cross because it was basically next door to the mainline station, and when the Bakerloo arrived in 1906, its platforms were built underneath the existing district structure. Wow, say that quick after a few. After some extremely confusing name changes over the years, the station we're at became Embankment, while the name Charing Cross got handed to the merged Strand and Trafalgar stations. And so now, on the Bakerloo, you've got an Embankment and a Charing Cross station, which is great for trying to comb through all the history. But nowadays, at Embankment, the weirdness seems to affect staff members the most. Back when the station was closed to replace the escalators, there was a contractor who was working alone on the platform. There was no one else around. All of a sudden, they were just aware of movement in the corner of their eye. From what they could see, it was a man wearing brown overalls. But it was what happened next that really stuck with them. Because without any warning, this man disappeared into a cloud of dust. Just poof. Gone. I'm gonna say that this guy wasn't down here in a closed-off London Underground station to practice his magic tricks, so that was a very weird thing to happen. But I don't know if that guy has ever been seen again after the work was finished and the station reopened. People do claim that the station itself just has a really eerie feeling, especially towards the ends of the platforms, which don't tend to be as populated with commuters. But the part of Embankment that people really talk about isn't open to the public at all. It's a disused staff tunnel known as Page's Walk, stretching beneath the Thames, and the people who have to go down there despise it. Many of them describe an oppressive atmosphere, like they're being watched by something utterly hateful. An anonymous contractor was interviewed on the documentary Ghosts of the London Underground, and he was saying that he'd worked all over London, in stations where they'd been bombed during the Blitz and others that had super dark history, all of these different places, but nothing affected him like Page's Walk did. And he had to be down there every day for a 3-month stretch, and immediately it felt like he shouldn't be there. He wasn't welcome. But you could also be walking along and just get hit with random cold spots where the temperature just plummets. Lights flicker on and off, and I mean, it's pretty dark down there anyway. That would be enough to have me heading towards the nearest exit. Some staff members hear footsteps following right behind them, and doors slamming is very common. But the thing that had most people on edge was just the atmosphere down there. Again and again, that unsettling vibe was what people complained about. So much so that, again, during that Ghosts of the London Underground doc, they had an investigator called Vic Tandy come in to try and get to the bottom of things. What he did find was that there was heavy infrasound in the tunnel, which is low frequency sound known to trigger anxiety and dread in people. What he also found though was that this tunnel, it wasn't isolated or sealed off or anything like that. So there was a draft when trains would pass through nearby tunnels, and that could very well put to bed the whole slamming door thing, because yeah, a draft would do it. But even knowing that there's a scientific explanation, that doesn't make it any less frightening when you're down there. Aside from Vic's explanation, a lot of people aren't convinced that that's all there is to it, with some even believing that there is something demonic lurking down in the Page's Walk. And I mean, that's a pretty bold claim, but I guess it just goes to show just how scared this makes people. And so, okay, let's say that there was something paranormal going on. Let's just suppose for a moment that maybe it's not just acoustics or the wind or whatnot. Why did these stories start? Why that specific tunnel? What's gone on here to warrant it becoming this super scary place to be alone? Well, there is a possible explanation that some believe may have something to do with it, because there was unfortunately a fatal crash on the 17th of May 1938, which involved 2 trains that had just passed through Embankment. At 5 minutes to 10 in the morning, a train that was travelling on the Circle Line towards Temple collided with the back of a District Line train that was stationary at a signal. The crash caused the deaths of 6 passengers, with 43 passengers and 2 linemen being taken to hospital for their injuries. It turned out what had happened was that there was a wiring error with the signal before the one that the District Line train was stopped at. It should have been displaying red, which would have stopped the Circle train, but instead it was green, and so they'd continued on. What's even worse is that this could have been avoided if someone had done something sooner. A train driver had noticed that the signal wasn't displaying correctly about 20 minutes before the crash, as the signal was, again, green, but he could see up ahead in the tunnel the rear lights of the train in front of him. He obviously told the staff when he got to Temple Station, like, look, something isn't right here. But that very vital information wasn't relayed to drivers in the following trains. And so now, something was left behind in the vicinity after this devastating crash where 6 people lost their lives. Because horrific events like that, surely that energy, that desperation when you're trying to rescue survivors, the discouragement when recovering bodies, all of that must energetically leave some sort of mark. Whether it's got anything at all with Page's Walk, who knows? But for us, it's time that we were moving on to the final station on the Bakerloo Line. Although we are far from done with the ghost stories, just before you start thinking we're wrapping up, we need to talk about Elephant and Castle Station. Similarly to Embankment, there was an existing underground station here before Bakerloo, which opened in 1890 as part of the City and South London Railway, what became the Northern Line. And a bit of history about the station, which isn't my usual brand of death, darkness and misery. The first baby born on the London Underground was born at this station in 1924. The baby girl's name was Mary Ashfield Eleanor Hammond, being named Ashfield after Lord Ashfield, who was the chairman of the railway at the time. And he actually agreed to be the baby's godfather, which that's a thing for sure. He did add a caveat though, in case any other prospective parents got any ideas. He said that it would not do to encourage this sort of thing, as I am a busy man. Yeah, that's fair enough. This station was also one of many across the city that was used as an air raid shelter during World War II, and although it survived relatively unscathed, at least compared to some other shelters, Elephant and Castle appears to be quite possibly the most haunted station on the Bakerloo Line. Staff members have witnessed doors being thrown open with with no explanation and no draft to cause it. Other times, just the handle is seen jiggling about, as if someone is on the other side trying to desperately open it, only there's no one there. But one poor staff member had this taken one step further when he was in his office late one night alone. Out of nowhere, something started aggressively banging on his office door. Whatever it was, it sounded like they were trying to break his door down. Clearly, there was some emergency, something going on. So when he opened the door, expecting to see a colleague who needed help immediately or something, he was absolutely floored to see that there was nothing there. Not a single living soul, despite the banging on the door literal seconds ago. Now it was just eerily quiet. Funnily enough, that was more than enough for the guy, and he put in for an immediate transfer. Yep, I think I would be right there with you on that one. But there is something else that happens at Elephant and Castle. So much that the entity responsible has been given the nickname the Runner. No one's ever actually seen them, it's only their footsteps that are heard, usually by station staff members working in the early hours of the morning. But they'll hear these hurried footsteps getting closer and closer, louder and louder, until it sounds like someone's about to run past you. And then the footsteps start to get quieter again. You hear that and then you don't see anything out of the ordinary. That's gonna have you thinking that you're hearing things. But it creeped out an employee so bad that they flat out refused to work nights at Elephant and Castle again. The smell of pipe smoke has also been encountered on the platforms, even though obviously they're non-smoking areas. Sometimes though, the figure of a young boy has been seen sitting on the edge of the platform, looking heartbreakingly sad. Obviously, that is not the sort of place where anyone should be sitting, and so concerned members of the public try and go over to see if he needs any help. But before anyone can reach him, he slowly fades away into nothing, leaving people wondering if they ever actually did see someone sitting there in the first place. But the most famous ghost story at this station surrounds the figure of a young woman wearing dark clothing, and she's seen getting onto the Bakerloo Line train, but disappearing immediately afterwards. And others will even see her on the platform itself, and she'll walk past them, but then fade away into nothing. So it doesn't just seem to be a case of it's a busy mode of public transport in a capital city, you're not going to be able to keep tabs on everyone's movement. And this was made abundantly clear to an employee who boarded a train at Elephant and Castle early evening-ish, around 6 p.m. He went on to walk through the train towards the driver, but he wasn't there at that point, so he just kind of walked back to the rear of the train to wait. At that point, a young woman got onto the train and walked straight past the guy, who actually moved out of the way so that the woman could walk past him. A bit of time went by and the driver arrived, so the crew member and the driver walked up towards the front of the train. But what stuck out to the staff member was that the woman was nowhere to be seen. There was no way that she could have slipped past him and got off the train without him noticing, and as she wasn't on the train itself, that meant that the only place that she could have escaped to was in the tunnel. And naturally, that was an issue. So the staff member mentioned it to the driver in a, I think there's someone in the tunnel, we need to shut everything down until it's been checked out kind of way. The driver just turned to him and went, "Oh, so you've seen her. We hear about her all the time." Which is, I feel like it probably wouldn't hurt to check, would it? Ghost story or not, just to make sure. But while this disappearing woman on the train seems to be the most famous ghost of the Bakerloo Line, we don't, again, have a solid idea of who she is. Some believe that she may be a woman called Elizabeth Stainsby, who died on the London Underground in 1867. It was a whole thing, as it was claimed that when she died, it may have been to do with the safety of the air quality down in the tube, as she was reported to have complained of the bad smell just before she collapsed. But the thing with Elizabeth was that she didn't pass away in the Elephant and Castle station. She became unwell on a moving train, and so she was transferred to a private room at King's Cross station, where she unfortunately passed away. However, the connection to Elephant and Castle was that her inquest was held at the Elephant and Castle pub, which is just over the road from the station. It's not the strongest link in the world, but it seems to have been enough to make some wonder whether Elizabeth has now become attached to the station. But weirdly, a different woman has also been witnessed within the tunnel near to the station. This woman is described as wearing a white dress, almost like a Victorian nightgown. She's usually seen by the train drivers, as she's been known to run out of the wall directly in front of the train. What sort of heart in your mouth, I'm gonna need so much therapy after this kind of ghost encounter is that? It obviously gets called in, but nothing out of the ordinary is ever found. Nowhere for this woman to have come out of the wall, first and foremost, but no body found, absolutely nothing. But if you don't spot any disappearing ghostly women, you may catch a glimpse of someone else travelling with you on the Bakerloo Line, as multiple passengers over the years have looked up towards the window of the train to see the reflection of a passenger sitting next to them, staring straight at them, only they know that there should be no one sitting next to them. They can see in the corner of their eye that that the chair is empty. But before they can even register anything else, the face staring at them in the reflection is gone. Sometimes though, the ghostly passengers of the Bakerloo Line are a bit more than just a fleeting reflection in the window, as there was an account from a guard who used to work on the line back in the 80s. He said that on certain services, especially later on in the evening, the rear carriage of the train would almost always be empty. Not for any particular reason other than the platform entrances normally lined up with carriages towards the front of the train. But that was totally fine, makes for a quieter shift. He'd close the door at each station and have the carriage pretty much to himself, lovely and peaceful. Only one night, after the train pulled away from one of the stations, he closed the doors as usual and turned around to see a man sitting at the far end of the carriage, which, with absolutely no context, you wouldn't even think twice about it, would you? But the thing was, this guard hadn't seen the man board at any of the previous stations. If anyone had got on that carriage, he would have known about it. It was like this passenger just appeared out of nowhere. And it was at that point that this feeling just hit him. Cold dread that something wasn't right. And as the train pulled away, this guard was almost holding his breath, watching this mysterious man and praying for the train to go a little faster and reach one of the larger stations where he knew that that carriage would then fill up with more people. He was so unsettled. But that atmosphere didn't dissipate, and so when it was time for his break, he flew off the train to escape that horrible feeling. Didn't even bother glancing back behind him. Because if it really was nothing, then fine, okay. But if it wasn't, he just didn't want that confirmation. And I mean, this is a guy that's employed as a guard, not likely a person prone to overactive imaginations running away with you kind of thing. Also, you would hope not one to miss a full-grown man walking past you. So the way that the guard described it, it was very weird, but not as horrendous as what one unlucky passenger endured. Because they were once travelling on the Bakerloo Line, and they were the only person in the carriage, but then they got that feeling where deep down you just know that you're not alone. Before they could try and calm themselves down, they started hearing footsteps running towards them from inside the moving carriage. Again, just don't love that. You're completely alone and start hearing, not seeing someone running towards you. Got worse though, as just when the footsteps reached where they were sitting, they heard a voice right in their ear scream at them to get out. Excuse me, no. Nope. They said that throughout the entire thing, they never saw anything at all, but just that they were, unsurprisingly, terrified. Completely justified. And to be fair, if I hadn't watched The Midnight Meat Train at a very formative age and traumatised myself out of ever travelling alone, that story probably would have done it instead. But this next one is about quite possibly the strangest image ever linked to the Bakerloo Line. Because in the early 80s, a woman named Karen Collette was travelling on the Underground with her family as they were visiting. At one point during the journey, her nephew turned to her and asked her to take his photo, which she did, just using a little cheap point-and-shoot camera. And at the time, that was it, just a nice little memento captured. Only when she eventually got the film developed a few weeks later, as for the kids watching, that's what you used to have to do. Oh my god, I'm turning into my grandparents. Anyway, Karen was looking through them and there was something strange in that photo of her nephew. There the little boy was, beaming away, but it was what was behind him in the reflection of the glass. Because it looked to be the image of a man strapped to an electric chair, which is certainly not what you'd immediately think of in the London Underground. But you could clearly make out the restraints around his wrists, the shape of the chair, and weirdly, bolts of lightning shooting from his hands. But this image matched a particular waxwork that was on display in the Chamber of Horrors in Madame Tussauds. It was a model of Bruno Hauptmann, the man executed via the electric chair in 1936 for the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. The image that Karen had somehow captured was exactly how this waxwork model was set up in the exhibit. The only thing different was that the waxwork never had lightning bolts coming out of it. So as Karen was trying to figure out how this image of Bruno's waxwork had come to be a part of this photo, the first rational explanation could be that it was a poster, an advert in one of the tunnels promoting the Chamber of Horrors. But outside of the platforms, the tunnels themselves don't have adverts in them, as the trains are moving too fast to actually get a good look anyway. So was it a poster inside the carriage? Possibly, but tube adverts usually sit above the windows and they're nowhere near that size. Plus, according to Madame Tussauds themselves, they've allegedly never used Bruno's waxwork in any of their promotional materials. Okay, so if it's not a poster or something then, what could it be? The photo was forwarded to the Society for Psychical Research, where none other than Maurice Grosse himself looked into it. Maurice, in case you don't know, was one of the investigators heavily involved in the Enfield poltergeist case. So I guess depending on how you feel about that case, that may change how you view the next bit of the story. But anyway, Maurice and other experts looked into whether it could have been some sort of double exposure, something wrong with the film itself. I mean, there was nothing wrong with the negative. Karen hadn't even visited Madame Tussauds to even take a photo of Bruno's model or anything like that. And to pull off a convincing image like that, you would need slightly better equipment than the camera that Karen had used. So in the end, there wasn't really a definitive answer for how this photo came to be. But as if the story wasn't strange enough, it apparently gets weirder, because a short while after this photo was developed, Karen went with a friend to visit a medium. She waited outside while her friend went in to get the reading, but when they'd finished, the medium came out and said to her, "I've got a message for you." Talk about ominous. What do you mean you've got a message for me? The medium went on to say, completely unprompted, no context, "Karen, you're being followed by someone, and he wants it known that he was blamed for something that he didn't do, but he did do something else that the police didn't know about." Okay then. Did the spirit of Bruno Hauptmann follow Karen from the London Underground? Or was there, in reality, some poster out there somewhere that Madame Tussauds forgot about or doesn't want to admit to keep the story alive? Because that reflection is very clear, and we don't have an answer about those lightning bolts. So while that's almost all of the strange reports tied to the Bakerloo's platforms and trains, there is a part of this line that the public never sees. It's completely closed off. But some of the staff who work in this area don't exactly describe the quietness as peaceful, because branching off at Lambeth North, there's the London Road Depot, which was the original depot for the Bakerloo Line from 1906. It's still in use today, it's where trains are stabled overnight, and while it sits below street level, it is above ground, so it's not like some deep underground chamber or anything like that. However, that doesn't stop staff members from feeling very creeped out here, especially at night. The sounds of metallic tapping have been heard, and that could easily be metal contracting as it cools down or whatever, maybe? Though apparently, this metal tapping sounds almost exactly like an old-fashioned wheel tapper. Basically, an employee who back in the day would have walked along the train tapping each wheel with a hammer, listening for cracks or faults in the metal. But shadowy figures have also been seen moving around the depot and disappearing into the entrance to the underground tunnel. There aren't really any defining features to these figures, but people say that they look almost blurred around the edges. But one particular figure who is seen is that of a nun, and she's said to appear looking very distressed, although no one can help her as she disappears before you can get close to her. And we don't know who this supposed nun is meant to be, but the story we do have is that she may be linked to Notre Dame Roman Catholic Girls' School, which sits right next to the depot. And the school's been there since the mid-19th century, founded by the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, and it was supposedly built on what was already a religious site. However, I didn't find any more information about any hauntings tied directly to the school itself. What I did find, though, was that Catherine Tate went to school there. Whether she encountered a distressed nun while she was there, that is sadly unconfirmed. But some believe that the activity has more to do with the tube itself, or rather what the underground was built around. Because where the tunnel connects to the Bakerloo, there are two tracks. One leads straight onto the line, while the other runs into a little dead end, which is useful for shunting trains around the depot or as a safeguard if any of the trains get out of control. But behind this dead end wall lies one of London's many plague pits, meaning that the dead are still buried very close to this depot, which as a TfL staff member is not the most comforting thought when you're hearing strange sounds around there in the middle of the night, knowing that meters away there are still people who died before their time and were buried centuries ago. Yep, but nothing out of this entire episode comes close to this next story, because there was a woman called Maureen Abbott who claimed to see something frankly unbelievable on the Bakerloo line. She said it was around 1954 or 55. She was waiting for the train home after visiting her mum. She was just standing there when all of a sudden she saw something move in the tunnel. It was something large and black and low to the ground. It was moving fast, but it was hugging the tracks like it knew where it was going. It tore down this stretch of track in front of her, and for a split second as it passed, she locked eyes with it. And that's when she realised that whatever this thing was, those weren't normal animal eyes. They were human. And only after it had disappeared into the darkness did her brain catch up and try to make sense of it. Because what she believed that she had just seen was a huge black cat, like a panther, racing along the Bakerloo tunnel. And when she looked around the platform to see if anybody else had reacted, she realised that she was completely alone. But that now that she was left in the wake of it, it was eerily silent, too quiet, almost as if she was standing in frozen time or something. It just felt so strange to her. Eventually though, things slowly started to return to normal. More people filed onto the platform and the next train arrived to take her home. And so that was that. At least for that day. A few days later though, Maureen was at home alone with her baby when there was a knock on the door. She went to answer it to see a woman dressed all in black. But this woman really didn't look well. She was very pale and thin, like she'd never had a good meal in her life. But then this woman in black started to speak, saying that she was from the government and she wanted to talk to Maureen about what she'd seen in the underground. First of all, aside from this strange person standing in front of her on a random weekday morning, how on earth did this so-called government official know about what Maureen had seen? Either way, she was still just a little rattled by the whole encounter, and so she did the most British thing that you can do in that situation, and she invited this government official inside and made them a cup of tea. The first question that the government woman asked was, "Have you told anybody about what you've seen?" Maureen responded, saying that the only person that she'd told was her husband, Ron. And at that, the woman forced a very tense smile, seemingly pleased with that answer, or the closest emotion that she was able to feel to that. She only asked one other question, wanting to know if there had been any weird odours in the house since Maureen's encounter. I mean, she's got a newborn baby. Strange smells aren't exactly unusual in that situation, but Maureen replied saying no unexpected odours. And at that, the government woman stood up, quickly thanked Maureen for her time, and was out the door, gone, before she could even respond. So Maureen was just left there, standing alone in her living room, wondering what on earth has just happened. She said that it didn't feel hostile or intimidating, it was just odd. Although she couldn't explain why, but she got the overwhelming urge to clean the entire house immediately. Her brain was saying to her that something wasn't right. She never elaborated more on what that meant, if there was anything else to the reason why she felt so uneasy. But that was it for Maureen's encounter. She never saw anything like that again. And this black cat, as far as I can tell, hasn't been seen on the Bakerloo Line since, although I am sighting a black cat right now. Are you about to yowl? Oh no, you're gonna jump up here. Hello, Lucifer. Although there were a couple of stories of a puma-looking cat spotted on the Central Line in the 1990s, but no reports of any government officials following those sightings. So whether it's a figure slipping between carriages, a sinister voice in an empty train, or something inhuman pacing the tracks in the dark, it seems that there's more than just trains passing through the shadows of the Bakerloo Line. So if you find yourself at a certain station on the line late one night, maybe you'll catch a glimpse of a young woman in dark clothing stepping on board, knowing full well she's not going to be there when you look again. But let me know your thoughts on the stories of the Bakerloo Line. Have you had your own encounter with any of these entities yourself? Please tell me all of the things. I found this one really interesting to put together, as unlike the Central Line and the Northern Line, the stations that I chose for the Bakerloo didn't have as much dark history surrounding them. Not quite as many plague pits or disasters, and yet seemingly just as haunted. Obviously, one explanation that we cannot ignore, but that also can be applied to all stations on the London Underground, is the sheer amount of accidents and tragically self-inflicted deaths that happen all the time. Even while I was researching this one last week, there was a disruption on the Bakerloo Line with that as the unfortunate reason. And for that number of people to go through something like that, not to mention the witnesses and the drivers of the trains themselves, and the amount of emotion that must linger down there is unthinkable. So similarly to my thoughts on other lines, I absolutely believe that something paranormal could be going on. Possibly not all of it. The doors slamming in the Pages Walk, I think that's more likely a draft. But then the image of Bruno Hauptmann, I'm still not convinced that that isn't a poster. But that's just what I think. You may have a different opinion. But if you like this video, please do give it a like. And let me know which London Underground line you'd like me to cover next. And if you haven't already, I think you'd be way cooler if you were subscribed to the channel too. But that is all from me today. Go and drink your water. You don't want to be getting chapped lips in this weather. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Whoa, what the f is that? What? I think that was a bean. Was that a bean? It was a bean. Why did you jump up on the radiator of all places? Don't be going all weird now. I've got 10 minutes left.